We continue now at the top of Daf Yomi Gemara and Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 11a. On the previous summit, the Gemara brought a Mishnah from later on. There's a machlokes ta'anoim in terms of bringing the blood of karbanos inside the hechel. Rabbi Akiva says the blood of any carbon that's brought inside the hechel is possible, it's disqualified. And then we have a machlokes between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Eliezer. The Rabbanan say that halacha applies only to the blood of a carbon chatos, and Rabbi Eliezer says no, there's a pasuk that says kachatos ka'asham. We compare the chatos to the asham, and so therefore just like the blood of the chatos that's brought into the hechel, that's a pasuk by the blood of the carbon chatos. Just like if that is brought into the hechel, it is possible, so too by the carbon asham, the same is true. And so the Gemara in the previous summit asked, so what's the reason of the Rabbanan? And we understand the reason of Rabbi Eliezer. He has this pasuk, kachatos ka'asham. There's a comparison between the chatos and the asham. What's the reason of the Rabbanan? And the Gemara now says, we learn the following kal v'chomer from carbon ola. If we find by ola shehi kalil, if we find by the carbon ola which is totally burned on the mizbeach, nichnas damo lifnim kasher, there we find that if the blood is brought inside the hechel, it is kosher. So asham she'eno kalil, when it comes to the carbon asham, which is not all burned on the mizbeach, lo kal shekain, certainly if the blood enters the hechel, it should certainly be true that it is kasher, that it is kosher. And Rashi explains the ola nichnas dama lifnim ksheira, by the ola, when the blood enters inside the hechel, it's kosher. That's bein l'Rabbanan, bein l'Rabbi Eliezer. Both the Rabbanan and Rabbi Eliezer agree to that. The lo darshin on kol v'chol, they don't make the drush of kol v'chol, which was mentioned on the previous amud. V'hekesha nami lekahacha, you also have no hekesh over here, so everyone agrees by ola. And so the Rabbanan again, they learn from ola, just like by ola we say that nichnas dama lifnim ksheira, so too when it comes to the carbon asham. The Gemara continues and says mala ola, but what's unique about ola? Can you really learn from ola? But ola has the following: shekain eina mechaperes. Ola is not a kapar, it's not an atonement, and so therefore you can't really learn from ola to carbon asham, which is an atonement. And the Gemara says to that, minchas chote, the carbon mincha of a sinner, that tochiach, that proves the other way, because that in fact is a kapara. And Rashi explains, minchas chote, the carbon ola v'yored, the shmiyas hakol. This is the mincha. There's the carbon ola v'yored, which is the variable chatos of shmiyas hakol. Again, that's talking about somebody who takes an oath that he doesn't know testimony. It's a false oath. So there's a variable chatos over there, and a person who's very poor brings a carbon mincha. That is a minchas chote. So tochiach, that proves the other way. Shemechaperes, because that is an atonement. And the halach is vim nichnas olifnim ksheira. That also, if it enters, just like the carbon ola, if it enters into the hechel, it's kosher. The lo pasal hakasav eladam, because the pasuk is only talking about a disqualification when blood enters into the hechel, and of course carbon mincha has no blood, and so therefore we can learn from minchas chote, and so minchas chote teaches the other way. And the Gemara continues and asks, V'leima chatas ha'of tochiach. Well, why not say that the chatas ha'of teaches the other way? Why are you bringing minchas chote? You could bring the chatas ha'of. Rashi explains, V'neima chatas ha'of tochiach v'hachi shaper tvei. That actually would be an even better proof. Shehumi minei damim, because there you do have blood involved. U'ra'uya l'hochiach al minei damim. So you can really bring a better proof in terms of cases that involve blood. And again, chatas ha'of would be similar to the minchas chote. You have a variable chatas. By the case of shmiyas hakol, a person who's poor brings a bird carbon. A person who's very poor brings the carbon mincha. So why not bring the proof from chatas ha'of? You say just like chatas ha'of, if the blood enters into the hechel, it's kosher. Again, so too over here by the asham. The Gemara says to that you can't bring a proof from there because chatas ha'of, boyd Rabbi Avin, he actually chatas ha'of is a question of Rabbi Avin. It's not 100% clear what the halach is over there. Rashi says chatas ha'of boyd Rabbi Avin, he heicha dehichnes damo lifnim bitzavar. Let's say a person brings the blood into the hechel bitzavar by its neck, she'ein ledama kabbalah, because there's no kabbalah. You don't receive the blood of the bird carbon, of the bird chatas in a vessel. That's why we're talking about bringing the blood in the neck. Is going to be a question whether that actually is disqualified or not. And that question is not answered, so therefore we can't really bring any proof from the chatas ha'of. And the Gemara continues and says, "V'lifruch," but then why don't we refute the proof from minchas chote? Ma'ala minchas chote shekain eina min zevach. You can't bring a proof from minchas chote. That's not a type of zevach. It's not a slaughtered kind of a carbon. It's just, again, it's a carbon mincha. And so the Gemara says, well, you go back and forth. Ola tochiach, ola will prove the other way. V'chazar hadin, you go back and forth. Lo roizeh karoizeh, v'lo roizeh karoizeh. The minchas chote is not the same as the ola. The ola is not the same as the minchas chote. Each has its own uniqueness. Hatzar hashav shabahen, the common denominator is shehein kodshei kodshim, they are kodshei kodshim, v'nichnas lifnim kasher, and if they enter into the hechel, they are kosher. Af ani avi asham, so too I can bring the carbon asham, shu kodesh kadoshim, that is holy of holies, v'nichnas damo lifnim kosher, and if its blood enters into the hechel, it is kosher. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Rava mi Barnish le Ravashi. Rava from Barnish said to Ravashi, V'lifrach, why don't we ask the following? Mal hatzara shava shebehen, we can find a different common denominator between the Ola and the Minchas Chote. Shekain ein lohen kitzva, there's no set value, you have no minimum value for those karbonos. Tomar ba'asham sheyesh lo kitzva, whereas by the karbonosham, there is a set value, there's a minimum value that was mentioned on the previous Amud, so maybe you can't learn out asham from them. And so the Gemara instead says, Ella hainu taimai de Rabbanan. Actually, the reason of the Rabbanan is as follows. The reason why they say if the blood of the Asham enters into the Heichel, it's Ksheira. It's because the Amar Kra, it's because the Pasuk says, Dama, it says its blood. And we darshan, we learn from there, Dama Shelzu, the blood of this carbon, meaning Chatas, Velo Dama Shel Acher. It's an exclusion. It does not apply to the blood of other carbonos, and therefore it would not apply to the blood of the carbon Asham. Rashi says, Dama Asher Yuva Mi Dama, that's the pasuk again by Chatas, that the blood is brought inside of the Heichel, and so essentially the Rabbanan learn it from a pasuk. The Gemara says, well, according to that, V'idach, so the other opinion, meaning Rabbi Eliezer, what does he do with Dama? He uses it for something else, Dama Velo Besara, that the halacha applies specifically to blood and not the flesh of the carbon. Rashi explains, Velo Besara Shem Nichnas Besara LaHeichel, if the flesh of the carbon enters the Heichel, Ein Nefseles, that would not create a disqualification, so that's what he does with Dama. V'idach, in the other opinion, the Rabbanan, Dam Dama, they can actually learn two things from Dama, because it could have said Dam, and so you're learning from the word Dama, Dama Shel Zu V'lo Dama Shel Acher, and the fact that it could have said Dam, and instead it says Dama, we're going to learn Dama V'lo Besar, we can learn both. V'idach, in the other opinion, Rabbi Eliezer, Dama Lo Darish, he does not darshan the fact that it says Dama instead of Dam. Rashi explains Dama lo darish. He doesn't darshan from the fact that it could have said dam instead of dama. They came into lo motzi lemichta v'chol chatas asher yuva el ohel moed, because it could not have written any chatas that you're going to bring to the ohel moed. The itzrich lemichtav dam lemuutei baser, because you need to write the word dam, because you certainly need to exclude the flesh of the carbon. So orchei dekra lemichtav mi dama. It's the normal way of the pasuk to write dama. That's not considered something extra, so you can't darshan from that. And the Gemara now continues and returns to the Machlokas Tanoim in the Mishnah. Again, the Machlokas Tanoim in the Mishnah was with regards to carbon Asham that's Shalo Lishmo. According to the Tanakama, it's only the carbon Chatas and carbon Pesach that are totally disqualified Shalo Lishmo, but that does not apply to carbon Asham. And Rabbi Eliezer disagrees. He says carbon Asham as well is totally disqualified if it is Shalo Lishmo. And the Gemara says, B'Shalom L'Rabbanan, it makes sense according to the Rabbanan. The Amri Asham Shashachtu Shalo Lishmo Kasher, that they say a carbon Asham is slaughtered Shalo Lishmo, it's kosher. Hainu de iskish mincha lechatas mincha laasham. That's why there's a comparison of carbon mincha both to carbon chatas and to carbon asham. Titania, as we learned in a brayso, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says kodesh kadosham hi kachatas v'cha asham. It says it's kodesh kadosham like a chatas and like an asham. Why is the carbon mincha compared to both a chatas and an asham? The answer is minchas chote. When it comes to the carbon mincha brought by a sinner, harei hi kachatas. That carbon mincha is like a chatas. Lafikach kamsa shalo lishma psula. Therefore, if you take the kometz, the fistful, shalo lishma, just like a carbon chatas is puzzle, so too the minchas chote will be puzzle in that situation. Minchas nedava, but when it comes to a carbon mincha that is a nedava donation, harehi kasham, that kind of carbon mincha is like a carbon asham. Lafikach comes to shalo lishma ksheira. Therefore, if you take the kometz shalo lishma by a minchas nedava, it's kosher just like a carbon asham. So it makes sense according to the Rabbanan, just like asham and chatas are different in terms of shalo lishmo, carbon mincha also is. In some ways it's compared to carbon chatas, that's by minchas chote, and in some ways it's compared to carbon asham, that's by minchas nedava. Elul Rabbi Eliezer, but according to Rabbi Eliezer, l'may hilchasa iskish mincha l'chatas u mincha l'asham. For what halacha is mincha compared to a chatas and is mincha compared to an asham? And the Gemara continues and answers l'chi idach to Rabbi Shimon. It's for the other teaching of Rabbi Shimon, the Tanan, as we learned in a Mishnah. This is in Meseches Menachos, and it's also talking about the kometz of mincha. The machlokas here is as follows: shalo b'kli shares psula. According to the Tanakam, if you have the kometz not in a kli shares, that disqualifies it. It's disqualified in such a situation. For Rabbi Shimon machshin, Rabbi Shimon says it's kosher even if it's not b'kli shares, and that's a machlokas tanoim. V'yomer Rav Yehuda b'reid Rabbi Chia, and Rav Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Chia, says, my time with Rabbi Shimon. What's the reason of Rabbi Shimon? Amar kra kodesh kadashim hi kachatas v'cha'asham. Again, the pasuk says it is kodesh kadashim like a chatas and like an asham, and so again we have a comparison to both. Boli ovda biyad, if he wants to do the avoda with his hand, ovda biyamin kachatas, then he does the avoda with his right hand like a carbon chatas. Bechli, and if he's doing the avoda with a vessel, then ovda bismol, then he can do the avoda with the left hand, ka'asham, like a carbon asham. And so according to Rabbi Eliezer, that is the comparison between chatas and asham. And the Gemara continues and asks Rabbi Shimon, but what about Rabbi Shimon himself? Because now we've quoted Rabbi Shimon as the source for what the Rabbanan do to the comparison of Mincha to Chatas and Asham, and we've quoted Rabbi Shimon for the source in terms of what Rabbi Eliezer does from the comparison of Mincha to Karban Chatas and Karban Asham. So what about Rabbi Shimon himself? Rabbi Shimon Haikra Mapik Leilahachi, Umapik Leilahachi. Rabbi Shimon uses the same pasuk of Kachatas v'Cha'asham. He uses it for this and for that. He used it for both. And the Gemara continues and answers, Ikar Kra, actually the main use of the pasuk, L'chad Rav Yehuda Bereid Rav Yehuda. It's really for what Rav Yehuda, the son of Rav Chia, said above. Again, the halacha about Kli Shares in terms of Karban Mincha. The second one that we brought from the Mishnah in Meseches Menachos, and therefore, according to Rabbi Shimon himself, Minchas Chote de Psula Shalo Lishma. The fact that a Minchas Chote is disqualified Shalo Lishma, Taima Achrinahu. There's actually another reason for that does not come from the Kachatas Ka'asham pasuk, the comparison to Chatas and Asham. Rather, the reason why Minchas Chote is Psula Shalo Lishma is because Chatas Taima Mai. What's the reason why a Karban Chatas itself is Pasal Shalo Lishma? Dechsib Bahi, because it says the word he. That's where we learn out the idea of the psul, the idea of the disqualification, shelo lishma. Minchas chote namik sibbehi, by Minchas chote also, it says the word he, and that's the actual source, that Minchas chote, the karban mincha of a sinner, is disqualified, shelo lishma. And the Gemara continues, Ulu Rabbanan, now according to the Rabbanan, so Lamai Hilchasa Iskish Asham Lachatas, so for what purpose, for what halacha, for what practical halacha is Asham compared to Chatas? Again, according to the Rabbanan, Karban Asham is not disqualified, or not totally disqualified, Shalo Lishmo, but Chatas is, and so the comparison is, Lomar Lach to say to you, Machatas tu Smicha, just like Chatas requires Smicha, which is leaning on the animal, Af Asham Ta'un Smicha, so too Karban Asham requires Smicha. And Rashi explains, Kodesh Kadashim Hika Chatas V'cha Asham. Again, it's Kodesh Kadashim like the Chatas and like the Asham. B'minchahu Dichsiv. This pasuk is written by the Karban Mincha. The Kamer Rabbi Shimon says, "Mi dekamakish minachos lechatas v'yasham." From the fact that there's a comparison between Mincha and Chatas and Asham, lahachi makish l'shneihem lomar lach diyesh mehem kachatas v'yesh mehem ka'asham. It's compared in order to tell you some are like a Chatas and some are like an Asham. Shetei minchas chote kachatas. The minchas chote is like a Chatas. The lo lishma psula, that if it's not lishma, it is disqualified. Minchas nedava ka'asham, and a minchas nedava is like an asham, the kasher shalo lishmo. That is kasher shalo lishmo. Elul Rabbi Eliezer, but according to Rabbi Eliezer, kevan the chatas v'yasham ki adadi ninu, since chatas and asham are the same with regards to shalo lishma, they're both disqualified. Lamai hilchasa iskish latarvaya. What's the point of comparing to both of them? And the answer is shalo b'klishares. Again, there's a machlokas tanoim. Let's say you have a karban mincha not in a klishares. Rabbi Shimon says it's kosher. Tanakama says disqualified. So again, shalo b'klishares, shalo kidesh hakometz b'klishares. You didn't sanctify the kometz in a klishares. According to the Tanakama psula, it's disqualified. Shahamenachos hukshu l'zvachim, because the Tanakama holds karban mincha is compared to zevachim, which again are the animals that are brought as karbanos. Liton arba avodos. That means that it requires 4 avodos, and there's something corresponding to each avoda by mincha. Kemitza keneged shchita. Taking the fistful is the equivalent of shchita by an animal. Matan kometz b'klishares, placing the kometz in the klishares, that's keneged kabolas hadam, that corresponds to the receiving of the blood. Holacha keneged holacha, walking it is corresponding to walking it over to the mizbeach. And haktara keneged zrika, the burning of it is the same as the zrika, the throwing of the blood by an animal, karbon. And so therefore it is critical that it's in a klishares according to the Tanakama. Rabbi Shimon machshir, Rabbi Shimon says it's kosher. Im holicho biyado bekom, so he can take it in his hand, in his fistful. Ad hamizbeach v'hiktir, he can take the fistful in his hand to the mizbeach to burn it according to Rabbi Shimon. And what was the reason of Rabbi Shimon? That's what Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Chia, taught, that kachatas ucha asham, it's like a chatas and an asham. Lahachi iskish mincha lechatas ul asham. It's for this reason that mincha is compared to chatas and asham. She'enon shavin b'hilchosein, those are not the same in their halachas. Lomar lach, to tell you, ba la'ovda b'holacha v'aktara b'yad, if he wants to do the avodos with his hand, shalobically without a vessel, so ovda b'yamin, then he does it with his right hand. Sha'akometz ba kizrikas dam, because the kometz will then be the equivalent of the zrikas dam, the throwing of the blood, by a chatos, by a karban chatos, shehi b'yad, which is done with the hand, be'etzba with the finger, uviyamin, and specifically with the right hand. Dechsib b'chatos, because it's written by the chatos, v'lokach hakohen midam hachatos be'etzbo v'nasan. It says the kohen will take from the blood of the korban chatos with his finger and do the applications of the blood. V'darshinan lekaman b'perek beis, and we darshan later on in the second perek, b'etzba'o v'nosan, that he does it with his finger, shelo tehin nesina ela biyamin, that placement has to be, that application has to be with the right hand. D'chol makom shenemar etzba u'kahuna, anytime it says finger and kahuna, eino ela yamin, it means the right hand. And Rashi continues, ba la'ovda b'kli, if he wants to do the service with a vessel, rashoy la'ovda b'smol, then he's permitted to do the service with the left hand. L'holech ha'kli shekitsha b'socho b'smol l'mizbeach, he can take that kli, which again, he sanctified the kometz in that kli, he can take it with his left hand to the mizbeach, v'litan b'smola min ha'kli alo ishim, and he can do the application with his left hand from the vessel onto the fires. Kisurikas dam osham, that would be similar to the throwing of the blood of an osham, shehu min ha'kli l'mizbeach, which is done from the vessel to the mizbeach. She'ena b'nesinas etzba, that's not done with the application of the finger. Delo ksiv etzba ela b'chatos, because it only says etzba by a chatos, uksheira b'smol, and it would be kosher with the left. Rabbi Shimon, according to Rabbi Shimon, b'chol hazvachim chutz mechatos, with all karbonos except for korban chatos. The aminon lekamon b'perek sheni, because we'll say later on in the second perek, zorak b'smol puzzle, throwing with the left is puzzle. V'Rabbi Shimon ma'achshir, and Rabbi Shimon says it's kosher chutz mechatos, except for the chatos. Mishum de Rabbi Shimon tarti boy, because Rabbi Shimon says we require two. It has to say etzba u kahuna, it has to say finger and kahuna. The gamrina mi mitzorah dechsib by etzba u kahuna. It says by the mitzorah, we learn from there, it says etzba and kahuna. V'yamin, and there it's talking about the right. V'taval hakoyin be'etzba o hayemonis. It says over there with his right finger. Uvizrikas kol hazvachim lo ksiv bo etzba, by the throwing of the blood of all the other karbonos, it doesn't say the word etzba. Ela kahuna, it only says kahuna, chutz mechatos, with the exception of chatos, and that's why Rabbi Shimon says that halacha applies only to korban chatos. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Yosef ben Choni Omer, Yosef ben Choni says, Hanishchot, and if you have other karbonos that are shechted l'shem chatos, meaning as a korban chatos, or l'shem pesach, as a korban pesach, so those are disqualified. And the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, Yosef ben Choni, Rabbi Eliezer, Amru davar echad. Yosef ben Choni and Rabbi Eliezer, they say the same thing, meaning Rabbi Eliezer agrees with Yosef ben Choni that other karbonos that are shechted as korban pesach or as korban chatos are going to be disqualified. Rashi explains, Amru davar echad, they say the same thing. To Rabbi Eliezer nami pasul, Rabbi Eliezer also says it's disqualified. Ba'acherim hanishchotim l'shem pesach, by other karbonos which are slaughtered as korban pesach bismano, in the proper time of korban pesach, u'l'shem chatos, and if they were slaughtered as a chatos kol yemos hashana, that would be true all of the year. Umi braisa de l'kamon dayik la Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan is going to learn this from the braisa coming up. And the Gemara continues, Rabba Amar Rabba says, Ba'acherim l'shem chatos pligi. Actually, Yosef ben Choni and Rabbi Eliezer would argue in a situation where you have other karbonos that are slaughtered as korban chatos. And Rashi explains, V'Rabam, and Rabba says, Ba'acherim l'shem chatos pligi, they actually argue if you slaughter other karbonos as a korban chatos, meaning Yosef ben Choni v'Rabbi Eliezer, meaning Yosef ben Choni and Rabbi Eliezer would argue in a situation of chatos. V'lo pasol Rabbi Eliezer, ela ba'acherim l'shem pesach, Rabbi Eliezer would only say disqualified. He would only agree with Yosef ben Choni when you slaughter other karbonos l'shem pesach. Avol ba'acherim l'shem chatos, but if you slaughter other karbonos as korban chatos, so machshir, then he would actually say kosher. Kedetanya, as we're going to learn in the Braisa. Uvein Rabba, uvein Rabbi Yochanan, and whether Rabba or Rabbi Yochanan, daiki milsayu meham asnisa, they're inferring their opinions from this Braisa. Uve maskana bina lefrushe diukayu, and as the Gemara goes on, it will explain the inferences that they make. And the Gemara continues, Kedetanya, as we learn in the following Braisa, HaPesach she'avra shenaso, let's say you have a korban Pesach that's older than a year old, the animal is older than a year, V'shachto bizmano l'shmon, you slaughter that animal in the proper time for korban Pesach with the right intention for korban Pesach, V'chein hashochet acherim, and also let's say you slaughter other animals, l'shem Pesach bizmano, as korban Pesach at the time of korban Pesach, Rabbi Eliezer posel, Rabbi Yoshua machshir, Rabbi Eliezer says it's disqualified in that case, and Rabbi Yoshua says kosher. And Rashi explains, HaPesach she'avra shenaso, the korban Pesach that's more than a year old, meaning the sulo chazi lePesach. Now this animal is no longer fit to be a korban Pesach, it's too old. So stami l'shlamim, so the assumption is that it will be as a korban shlamim. K'deravinan le'el, as we say earlier, mikrai, we include that earlier from Sukkim. V'shachtu bizmano l'shmo, and then you slaughter it at the right time l'shmo. T'havale shochet shlamim l'shem Pesach. Essentially what's happening is, he's slaughtering a korban shlamim, because again, since it's too old to be a korban Pesach, it is assumed to be a Karban Shlamim, so he's slaughtering the Karban Shlamim l'shem Pesach. V'chein hashochet echad mikol hazvachim, and the same would be true if you slaughter any animal that was supposed to be a certain Karban l'shem Pesach bismano, but you slaughter it as a Karban Pesach in the proper time of Karban Pesach. And so therefore, again, returning to the Brisa, we have a Machlokas Tanoim. If you shecht other Karbanos as Karban Pesach at the time of Karban Pesach, again, Rabbi Eliezer says Pasul, and Rabbi Yeshua says it's kosher. And the Brisa continues, Amar Rabbi Yeshua says, in Bishari Yemos Hashan, if during the rest of the year, She'eno kosher l'shmo, if you would slaughter a Karban Pesach as Karban Pesach, when it's not the time for Karban Pesach, it's not kosher. Acherim ksherim l'shmo, but if you slaughter other Karbanos l'shmo during other times of the year, meaning you slaughter other Karbanos as Karban Pesach during times of the year which are not the time for Karban Pesach, it is kosher. So Bismano, so during the time of Karban Pesach, Shu kosher l'shmo, where obviously the Karban Pesach is kosher if you slaughter it as a Karban Pesach, Eino din sheyichshu acherim l'shmo, shouldn't it be true that other Karbanos also should be kosher if you slaughter them as Karban Pesach? And Rashi explains, in Bishari Yemos Hashana she'eno kosher l'shmo, if the rest of the year, where if you slaughter it as Karban Pesach, it's no good. K'di alfinan la b'Meseches Psachim, we learn this out of Meseches Psachim. Shachtu kodem chatzos pasul, if you slaughter the Karban Pesach before chatzos, meaning not in the proper time, it's disqualified. Shenemar, it says bein harbayim, it says it has to be in the afternoon. V'kam epamim shana ha'kasav la'akev k'viyas mano b'yodalid bein harbayim, and the pasuk, the Torah, many times repeats the idea that it has to be on the 14th in the afternoon, and that's ma'akev. That's something that's absolutely required. And acherim ksherim l'shmo, other karbanos are kosher if you slaughter them for Karban Pesach, meaning not at the time of Karban Pesach. The Rabbi Eliezer modabo, even Rabbi Eliezer would agree to that. The lo poligela bismano kedetnan behedya, the only machlokus is in a situation where it's slaughtered at the time of Karban Pesach. Aval kol yemos hashana, but during the rest of the year, ein shem shchitas pesach chol al karban acher. The name, so to speak, of the slaughtering of a Karban Pesach is not going to take effect on another karban. Everyone would agree that that other karban is going to be kosher the rest of the year. And so therefore, again, Rabbi Yeshua argues, if you have a different karban that's not Karban Pesach, and you shecht it even during the time of Karban Pesach as a Karban Pesach, it should be kosher. And the Brisa continues, Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer said to him, he responded to Rabbi Yeshua, O chilaf advarim, I can say the exact opposite, meaning to say, if you're going to make a kal v'chomer like you're making, then I can make a kal v'chomer that will lead to a conclusion that is certainly not true. Umayim b'shari yemos hashan, if during the rest of the year, she'eno kosher l'shmo, if you slaughter a Karban Pesach as a Karban Pesach during the rest of the year when it's not the time for Karban Pesach, it's not kosher. But yet, kosher hu l'shem acherim, but yet if you would slaughter it for something else, it would be kosher. So bismano, so during the time of Karban Pesach, shu kosher l'shmo, where it is kosher if you slaughter it as a Karban Pesach, obviously, eino din sheyuchshel l'shem acherim. Wouldn't it be logical to say that if you slaughter the Karban Pesach at the time of Karban Pesach for some other Karban, it should end up being kosher based on this kind of kal v'chomer? V'yuchsher Pesach bar ba'asar shelo l'shmo, and then it's going to come out that a Karban Pesach is kosher on the 14th if it's slaughtered shelo l'shmo, which of course goes against exactly what it said in our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said that a chatos and a Karban Pesach are completely disqualified if they're shelo l'shmo. And Rabbi Eliezer continues, V'kachat ha'omer, and you say this logical derivation, Mali huchsharu acherim b'shar yemos hashana l'shmo. What does it matter to me that other karbanos are kosher during the rest of the year if they're slaughtered as Karban Pesach? That would make sense. Shekein hu kosher l'shem acherim, because the Karban Pesach itself, if it is slaughtered at that time, meaning not during the time of the Karban Pesach for some other karban, it's also kosher. So it makes sense to say that other karbanos are kosher the rest of the year if they're slaughtered as Karban Pesach. But v'yuchsharu acherim bismanu l'shmo, does that mean we should say that other karbanos during the time of Karban Pesach are kosher if you slaughter them for Karban Pesach? Shekein hu pasul l'shem acherim. At that time, if you slaughter the Karban Pesach for others, it's pasul, so you can't even make your derivation at all. And Rashi explains, Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says to him, he says to Rabbi Yoshua, O chilaf, we could say the opposite, in kal v'chomer atabo lidrosh, meaning if you're trying to darshan a kal v'chomer, yachol ani la'achlifu, I can switch it, be'inyan acher, in a different fashion, v'lomar davar sheinu, and end up saying something that's not true. Ulahachsher pesach bismano shelo l'shmo, we'll end up concluding that a Karban Pesach in its proper time, shelo l'shmo, is kosher, which is not the case. V'yuchsher pesach b'yodalid shelo l'shmo, will we say that a Karban Pesach on the 14th, shelo l'shmo, is kosher, uv'edin hazeh, according to your logic, according to your kal v'chomer, atayachol hachsher pesach bizmano shelo lishmo. You're going to end up saying that a carbon pesach in its right time shelo lishmo is kosher, which again is not true. V'chein ata omer, and then Rabbi Eliezer goes on to say, you're saying this derivation bitmiya. This is being asked as a question. Hatidrash kal v'chomer v'yiskashu. Should you say this kal v'chomer to make it kosher? Again, to make other karbonos during the time of carbon pesach kosher if they're slaughtered as carbon pesach. Mali huchshuru acherim kal v'chomer shadarashta yeshalav teshuva. The point is the kal v'chomer that you're making, we can respond to it. And Rashi continues, Mali huchshuru acherim v'chulu yuchshuru acherim. Again, this is the argument of Rabbi Eliezer to Rabbi Yoshua. Bitmi, it's being asked as a question against Rabbi Yoshua. The basic argument again is that you're trying to say that other karbonos at the time of carbon pesach, if they're shechted as carbon pesach, you're trying to argue that they're kosher because of the fact that other karbonos slaughtered as carbon pesach not at the time of carbon pesach are kosher, but you can't make that argument because look at carbon pesach itself. Carbon pesach not at the time of carbon pesach, if it is slaughtered for another carbon, it's kosher. But a carbon pesach during the time of carbon pesach that's slaughtered for another carbon is going to be puzzle, so you can't make your argument. And Rashi continues and notes, it's actually from here that Rabbi Yochanan infers what he said about Rabbi Eliezer. Again, Rabbi Yochanan said that Rabbi Eliezer agrees with Yosef ben Choni in our Mishnah, that when you have other karbonos slaughtered l'shem carbon pesach bizmano, or l'shem carbon chatas, they're going to be disqualified. And again, the Rabbi Eliezer agrees with that. V'yomer, and so Rabbi Yochanan says, D'chihechi deposel Rabbi Eliezer ba'acherim l'shem pesach. Just like Rabbi Eliezer is saying over here that other karbonos that are slaughtered as carbon pesach at the time of carbon pesach are disqualified, so posel ba'acherim l'shem chatas, that same logic will lead to the idea that if you're going to slaughter other karbonos for carbon chatas, it's going to be posel. Why? To have time with Rabbi Eliezer, because what's the whole reason of Rabbi Eliezer over here? Mishum dehu pasel l'shem achem. The reason is because we look at the carbon pesach and we say, since the carbon pesach is pasel during the time of carbon pesach, if it's slaughtered as a different carbon, so then we apply the same logic in reverse. The other carbon at that time, if it's slaughtered as carbon pesach, is going to be pasel. So v'achanami b'chatas isa, you can apply the exact same logic to chatas. When a chatas is slaughtered as a different carbon, it is pasel. So if a different carbon is slaughtered as a chatas, it's pasel. That's where Rabbi Yochanan gets what he gets regarding Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. V'rabba daik miseifa. Now Rabba is going to infer from the end, shechazer Rabbi Eliezer midin zeh. Rabbi Eliezer ends up retracting this argument. V'danu b'din acher. He ends up making a different argument. Umoda da'acherim l'shem chatas ksherim. And so therefore he would admit that other karbonos that are slaughtered l'shem chatas are kosher. And the Brisa continues, Amar lo Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yoshua says to him, he says to Rabbi Eliezer, Imkain, if so, Horata koach Pesach, you're lowering the strength of carbon Pesach, v'nasata koach b'shlamim, you're giving that strength over to carbon shlamim. And Rashi explains, Imkain, if so, im ataposal acherim l'shmo bizmano. If you're going to say that other karbonos are disqualified if they're slaughtered as carbon Pesach during the time of carbon Pesach, so Horata Pesach v'nasata koach b'shlamim, Pesach's strength is now lowered, and that strength is given over to shlamim. And Rashi explains, Shekol Hashana, because during the rest of the year, Shehizman Shlamim, which is the time of carbon Shlamim, Pesach HaNishchat L'Shem Shlamim kosher. If a carbon Pesach is slaughtered as a Shlamim, it's kosher. And so you see you're being pretty lenient with a carbon Pesach. It's Shelo L'Shmo during the time of Shlamim, and you're saying it's kosher. V'hayom, and now today, Shuzman Pesach, during the time, which is the time of the carbon Pesach, Kol Shlamim HaNishchat and L'Shmo Psulin, any Shlamim that's slaughtered as carbon Pesach is disqualified. And so you're really treating the Shlamim stricter than the carbon Pesach. Nimsas machshava shelo l'shmo gadol koach b'shlamim mi Pesach. It comes out that the intention of shelo l'shmo is stronger by shlamim than Pesach. We're actually more strict with the carbon shlamim. Ukroyash kachan, but yet we found in the pasuk before the achmor b'Pesach mi b'shlamim. The Pesach should really be stricter than shlamim. Tichsib behu, because it's written by the carbon Pesach the word hu. Uvechol Zevachim hechsher shelo l'shman. In general, we say by other karbonos shelo l'shman they're kosher. Again, Pesach is supposed to be the stricter of the karbonos. And the Brisa continues, Chazer Rabbi Eliezer v'danu din acher. So Rabbi Eliezer retracted, and instead he offered a different argument. Matzinu moser Pesach b'shlamim. We find that the leftover, so to speak, carbon Pesach, they can be brought as shlamim. The ein moser shlamim, but the extra, the leftover carbon shlamim, ba Pesach, they're not able to come. They cannot be brought as carbon Pesach. And so we can make the following argument: Uma Pesach shemosaro b'shlamim. If by Pesach, which it's remaining, it's extra, is brought as shlamim, shachto bizmanu l'shum shlamim pasul, but if you slaughter that Korban Pesach at its time as a shlamim, it's disqualified. So shlamim she'ein mosarn ba Pesach, shlamim which you cannot bring the extra shlamim as Pesach, im shachtim l'shem Pesach bismano, if you're going to slaughter them as Korban Pesach at the time of Korban Pesach, eino din shiu psul, and isn't it logical to say that they would be disqualified? And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yud Aleph Amud Beis.